Hello everyone. Today I'm going to share my experience of using the Canon R10 as my first bird and wildlife camera and what else I would consider if I had to buy it again in 2025. Now I don't have the R10 anymore because I bought the R7, but I'll clarify why I bought this. Let's get started. Last year I joined my bird photographer buddy for a few sessions. I used to have a Sony A7 III. My longest lens was 200 mm, but I had so much fun in that trip. And also, I used his camera, which is Canon R6, for a while, and I just fell in love with the Canon's subject tracking and how it tracks the bird's eye. So I was already considering the Canon R10, and I just happened to find a Canon R10 used in my local Facebook marketplace. So I just picked it up. I paired it with the Canon RF 100 to 400 lens. That makes it a super lightweight setup. And I'll make a dedicated video about that lens later. But in terms of the camera body, uh, it is perfectly fine. In my hands, I had no problems. The only thing you should consider if you're living in cold areas or if you have big hands, then it might be a problem because especially the navigation button, these ones on the R7 here, it is perfectly fine. On the R10, it's much smaller and it feels a bit cheap. But apart from that, in terms of ergonomics, how it feels in my hand, I had no problem with the Canon R10. In terms of shooting speed, Canon advertises 23 FPS and electronic shutter, but the electronic shutter is really bad. You have so much rolling shutter, and at the same time, the buffer fills up quite fast. But it shoots 15 FPS on mechanical or electronic first curtain shutter, which is still impressive for the camera of this price. I always shot zero instead of the full raw. That way, your file size is smaller and you can get a lot more shots before the buffer fills up. In my experience, I used to get about 3 seconds of continuous shots. I think it's roughly about 40 shots depending on which card you use. And once the buffer hits, it takes quite a while for it to clear. But it wasn't that big of a problem because I won't press the shutter for the really long time. I would just let it go when the action is happening. I'll just take shots in interval. So buffer was not a big problem. I'll just suggest getting a V90 card, or at the very least V60 card. I'll probably link a few in the description. In terms of autofocus, in good lighting, the autofocus works really well. It's only when the light drops, your keeper rate falls a bit because there is a bit of pulsing when there is not enough light, and sometimes it also doesn't perform as well as you feel like it's performing, because when you're looking through the EVF, a lot of times it shows that your bird or the subject is getting tracked, but after you copy the shots in computer, there might be a few shots which is not in focus. Don't get me wrong, it's still really good for $1,000 camera, but it's just something which I should mention. Battery life was pretty good. It uses the Canon LPE17 battery, so if you have an older DSLR, you might be able to use those. Just make sure you buy the Canon original batteries. If you buy the third party ones, only the fully decoded batteries charge inside the camera, so that's something you should consider. I generally went with 3 batteries in my sessions, and most of the day I didn't use my third battery, so it lasts 2 batteries last for the whole day for the most part. And I had bought third party batteries which would take the type C cable directly, and it comes with a dual type C charging cable. I'll link that in description. Image quality coming out of this 24 megapixel sensor is great, and it gives plenty of resolution for my use case. In terms of video, it shoots 4K 30 FPS. It also shoots 4K 60, but with an additional crop on top of an APS-C sensor, and it doesn't perform as well as good in low lighting, but sometimes it's useful when you want to get more reach out of your lens for videos. And it also shoots 1080p full HD in 120 fps without the audio. It's not as impressive, it's a bit soft, but that's what you get in most of the cameras in this price range. There are 2 areas where I didn't like the R10 so much. One is the lack of APS-C lenses in RF lineup. I know Sigma has announced a few lenses now, but if you compare it with Sony or Fujifilm or Nikon, the selection is still pretty, I would say, limited. The second complaint I have with R10 is really bad shutter shock on mechanical or electronic first curtain shutter. So if you shoot anything below 1/250th of a second, the images like have a bit of vibration in them, so it ruins a lot of your images. And then if you switch to electronic shutter, it has a lot of rolling shutter. So I would suggest if you shoot with this camera, shoot it above 1/250th of a second. Do I recommend the R10 as your birding camera in 2025? I have a very mixed feeling about Canon APS-C cameras in general. If you're in a tight budget, or if you're already invested in Canon system, you have EF lenses, then it makes sense. Having used the R10 and R7 both, if it was my money, I would not buy the R10 for the full price, and I would just save and get the R7, pair it with RF 100 to 400 lens. Or if you can find a used copy of EF 100 to 400 Mark II L series lens, that comes for about $1,100, $1,200 on eBay. That lens could be a great option. Another option could be the Canon R8 with the 200 to 800 mm lens. It will be slightly more expensive and heavier setup compared to the R7 combo, but I feel like Canon full frame autofocus is much better than their APS-C cameras. It doesn't have the fully mechanical shutter, but it has a faster reading sensor from the R6 Mark II, and it can shoot up to 40 frames per second in electronic shutter. The only difference is it's expensive compared to the R7 combo, and it's also heavy. Now let's look at some other options from different manufacturers. The first one which comes to my mind at the similar price of R10 is Z50 Mark II, or rather Z52 as Nikon says. Compared to R10, this one doesn't have 15 FPS, it shoots only 11, but that's plenty fast, I would say. And it also has the log recording if you're serious about grading your videos. And in terms of body as well, I prefer the Z50 more. I've used the version 1 of Z50 and I absolutely loved it. For the lens, if you're looking at really versatile setup, you can buy yourself the Nikon 28-400 lens. It covers a huge range, but in terms of price, it's more expensive than the RF 100-400. The other few options I would consider are the Tamron 50-400 and the Tamron 150-500 if weight is not a big problem for you. Personally, if I had to buy a setup for myself, I would actually push my budget to get the 180-600 lens, because the lenses hold their value pretty well. And let's say you decide to get a full frame camera later on, this lens will still be really usable on your full frame setup. Next option from Sony would be A6700. It's a bit more expensive than the R10 or Z50. It's more of a R7 competitor, but Sony has a lot more lens options in APS-C or full frame both. The first lens I would pick if I wanted a really lightweight setup is the 70-350 mm lens. In full frame terms, it'll give you 525 mm reach. It's probably shorter than all the other lenses I mentioned, but it's also the smallest one in this whole lineup. The second one I would consider is the Sigma 100-400 lens. That's also currently on sale. The two Nikon lenses I mentioned for the Z mount are also available on Sony as well. And next you have the Sigma 150-600. This is probably the cheapest 150-600 lens I mentioned in this video. And finally you have the Sony 200-600 lens if in case you decide to buy a full frame camera in the future. It'll be great. Last but not the least, you can also buy the OM System OM1. It's the only camera with the stack sensor in this lineup, and it's also a rugged professional body. And pairing with the Mzuiko 100-400 lens, you can get up to 800 mm of reach. The only caveat is it might not be that great in low light scenarios. Currently, I'm pretty happy with my R7 with the EF 100-400, but I'm really tempted to buy a camera with stack sensor because I love to shoot in electronic shutter mode. Let me know which camera or lens combo you will consider, or if you have any other setup, how's your experience? Share that in comment section. Thank you.